All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Glad to be here with everyone tonight. Chela, Jose Miguel Paez, Wa Amnishi. Hello, my name is Jose Miguel Paez, he, him, his. And I'm here today to be part of the Indigenous is Us, embracing ancestral knowledge and sharing the beauty of practice. Today, in interviewing with Pamela Villasenor from the Fernandeno Tataviam tribe. And first, just want to say what an honor it is to be invited into this space, to be here with you all tonight, and to get an opportunity to talk to folks about the important work that the Tataviam people are doing. I forgot to mention just a little bit about me. I am also a teacher at Cal State University Northridge in the social work department. I'm also a board member of Tia Chuchas and a social worker by training. So let me just read a little bit about tonight and what the night is going to be about. Share a little bit about the Indigenous as Us, and then a little bit about what this kind of the space kind of orient us to using the space here on Facebook and YouTube and wherever else we're streaming. And then we'll get into our event for the night. So Tia Chucha's Central Cultural and Bookstore, has the mission to transform community through ancestral knowledge, the arts, literacy, and creative engagement. And is honored to host this project called The Indigenous in Us, embracing ancestral knowledge and sharing the beauty of practice, honoring Fernandino, Tataviam land and peoples in conversation with Pamela Villasenor. This is part of our series of free public cultural events, which is aimed at showcasing Northeast San Fernando Valley community-based Indigenous practices of Native Mexica and the local Native American tribe, benefiting individual and social well-being through the sharing of ancestral knowledge and arts. The Indigenous in Us project has highlighted 4 Mexica danza groups in the San Fernando Valley area, including Grupo Ajolote from North Hollywood, Kalpuli Xochi Yeyot from Sun Valley, Kalpuli Tloque Nawake from Pacoima, and our resident danza group Kalpuli Temachtia Quetzalcoatl, based in Silmar. We recently hosted a curanderismo series with teachers from Morelos, Mexico, Viridiana Medina Rosas Tonazihua, and Juan Carlos Solano Alcocer, sharing various forms of healing wellness practices and ancestral calendar counts. And also my apologies if I mispronounced people's names. Sorry about that. For tonight, we're going to be talking about land acknowledgements and thinking about how to build a land acknowledgement. We're going to sort of examine our positionality in doing that, what it means to do that, and also highlight ways we're actually implicated in implicated and complicit, maybe even in dispossessing people, and what this land acknowledgement, the significance it is for Indigenous people. I myself identify as an Indigenous person. My father was born in the Philippines and he is a Celeste Indian, and my mother was born here and she is Mexican and Italian. So we come from a multi-ethnic home and we're enrolled members of the Confederated Tribes of Celeste. So for tonight, what we hope to do is engage you all in a collective dialogue to bring everyone together as a community. And we absolutely welcome your comments, your thoughts, reactions. We'll pose a lot of questions. So please feel free to use the chat to let us know your thoughts and reactions. So at this time, it's my honor to introduce Pamela Villasenor, an enrolled Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, where she has worked tirelessly to help with the tribe's nation building efforts. As executive advisor to the Office of the Tribal President, Pamela manages tribal government initiatives, including the development of the newly established Health and Social Wellness Department. As a passionate champion for Native families, Pamela serves as the tribe's authorized representative of the tribe for juvenile dependency cases. Additionally, she was part of the team that helped reform LA County training to include ICWA curriculum. For the past decade, she has been an ICWA trainer for county case workers. Over the years, Pamela has held prestigious fellowships with Americans for Indian Opportunities Ambassadors Program and Native Americans in Philanthropy Circle of Leadership Academy. Using the knowledge gained from these experiences, She helped build the capacity of the tribe's Special Projects Division and nonprofit Pukuu Cultural Community Services. Pamela has created, led, and participated in numerous projects for the betterment of the people, of her people. Her particular interest is the empowerment and wellness of her tribal community. Thus, some of the projects she has worked on include violence prevention, cultural arts, economic development, grants management, facilitation and training, and advocacy for the rights of the tribe. So it is with great honor to introduce and welcome Pamela Villaseñor.
Hamanatha, it's nice to be with all of you today and nice to see you again, Jose. I'm excited to have this conversation tonight.
Yeah, great to see you as well. And thank you for being here and sharing the time tonight. So what we were going to be doing tonight is talking about land acknowledgements. And you and I have talked about this quite a bit. And I think that's one of the reasons why this makes sense, especially maybe given this particular week, which I know is a holiday for a lot of people around Thanksgiving. But for Indigenous people, I think we have a different feeling about what this day actually represents and what it signifies. So I think the fact that we're doing this event on this week is significant and means something. But we wanted to take a moment to first start to explore a sense of place and people of this land. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that particularly.
Thank you. And as Jose mentioned, I'm from the Fernandeno Tataviam Band of Mission Indians on my maternal side. And on my paternal side, I'm Mexican American. So my family has an immigration story, actually a few. And so it's really wonderful to talk about the intersectionality of Indigenous peoples, pre-borders, post-borders, whatever space and time we're talking about. In terms of my people, the Fernandeno Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, our homelands stretch from what are today known as the northern portions of the city and county of Los Angeles. So those are villages from throughout the San Fernando Valley, through Santa Clarita to Antelope Valley, and the most eastern portion of Simi Valley. And when you think about how large that is, you probably think, wow, that's huge for a tribe. And that is. And that's because we didn't actually exist as just some huge tribe. It was really a coalition of villages and village families. So even today, to be enrolled in our tribe, you have to know your village and be connected to your specific lineage. And through that, we actually have a lot of different tribal groupings. So I think sometimes when people look at our name, they think, oh, you're all just Tataviam. And that's not actually true. So Fernandeno is just the Spanish name that was given to us because we were the builders and enslaved at the San Fernando Mission. And so Spanish being the first settlers here, that's what they called us. It was easier for them. But in terms of ourselves, we have our own names for all of our villages. But what makes it more complex is that we have these beautifully complex kinship practices. So how we know who we are, who our family is, where we're supposed to intermarry. And as a result, some of us are Tataviam and Chumash and Pipimaram and these different tribal backgrounds. But just to make it easier, we say we only include one of those in the title of our tribe's official name. But if you ever sat down and spoke with any of us, they'd probably spend a little time explaining to you more of who their people are and their families and their villages. My village is Xiutkanga, and that's a village in Encino. Today, if you ever go down Ventura Boulevard, there is a state park called Los Encinos. It's a very small portion on what was my family's village. We were given that village actually in title as like a pre-reservation in Mexican-controlled California, but it was eventually taken in the American period after California became a state. So a lot of complexity, a lot of different information, but I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about this series with the Achuchas and really honing in to who we all are in Northeast San Fernando Valley.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That is so powerful, and just hearing that makes me feel very, very proud, and I think there's a sense of like of liberation actually, because it's just like these are the stories that have been told about us so many times, and the fact that you're able to tell your story about you, and reclaim, not only these the names, but also the lands, and actually say this is very, very powerful. So thank you for sharing that with us and orienting us to this space. Um, I know there was some questions. I don't know if you want to maybe pose a couple questions. I know we have people watching right now, but maybe just to kind of get people thinking about, what it means to be on these lands.
Yes, I'd like to know if anyone in the audience identifies as Indigenous and whatever that means to them.
And at this time, for those of you who are watching and can comment, feel free to write a comment in either one of the chats, and let us know. I can say, Pamela, as you were talking, we are part of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz. But like you, that means that there are many tribes and many different villages, and so through a lot of work, from my father, to try to trace this back and understand where my great grandmother grew up, we learned that we're part of looks like the Galice Creek and Rogue River tribes, and actually maybe even one other. But those to unearth those stories, or to find out that lineage, is really difficult, and I think it takes a lot of time and effort to really do that.
That's wonderful to start thinking about, our own families. Even as Indigenous people, we have a responsibility to our families and to our stories and to our future generations. I think sometimes people expect us to have all the answers as an
Right,
Indigenous person, and
right.
oftentimes we don't. And there has to be that opportunity for our own cultural humility, in that we are just like anyone else and still learning.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, right. And also that we're not the spokespeople for all other indigenous people, which I think that also kind of connects to this land acknowledgement piece as well that we'll talk about here. Um, so one of the things that when we can kind of transition to thinking about these acknowledgements, and I wanted to take a moment to read a couple quotes that actually you had shared with me. I think are really, really important when we think about acknowledging the land. So this first quote, this comes from the USDAC and their Honor the Native Land Toolkit. And their quote is, "Acknowledgement by itself is a small gesture. It becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed action. But this beginning can be an opening to greater public consciousness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, a step toward equitable relationship and reconciliation." And just in thinking about that, and end quote, and thinking about that quote, it brings up a lot of really important issues regarding sovereignty, cultural rights, equitable relationship, and reconciliation. There's got to be a healing component, a reparative action component, as part of these acknowledgements. And this last comment here from Lori Poirier says, quote, "There's a lot of this good will that doesn't create local economic or creative opportunities for Native artists and families. And what I'm looking for is for long-term relationships and non-extractive engagements that value our cultural practices," end quote. So I just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, if you wanted to share any ideas about either of those quotes, and Pamela, and also people in the comments, feel free to add your thoughts there as well.
Land acknowledgements are so important to Indigenous peoples. And even when I traveled throughout the country before the pandemic, of course, I felt a responsibility to know whose lands that I was on that day, because I was a visitor that day. Just because I'm an Indigenous person doesn't mean that I don't have a responsibility into being just as respectful to other tribal communities. And so it's so great having this be echoed in these quotes, especially from Lori Poirier, who's operating the First Peoples Fund, and how transformative that's been in actualizing land acknowledgements, but through the cultural arts, and supporting Native artists and making sure that those arts are accessible to other people in the community for the longevity of a lot of these cultural arts, which have been threatened over the years. And I think when we talk about land acknowledgement, we have to realize just how it can be stretched to impact so many other parts of our lives and many different people in our communities.
Yeah, right. And I think that also gets to that extracting part of, we like to take your information or take your art, or we hang it up on our walls, but no recognition of, or actually no discussion of the fact that you're also on the land that you stole, or where you enslaved indigenous peoples for many years. So at this point, let's kind of transition here, thinking with this kind of as the context, starting to think about like a temperature check, to kind of get trying to get an overall, it's like a spectrum of where we are at in this, and thinking about our organizations and thinking about our own individual behavior or thinking. But I know there's a document that you have been working on, to kind of think about as we start building our land acknowledgement statement.
As the graphic comes on the screen, I just want to acknowledge that this is from the Art Changes, which was a national initiative housed by CalArts and was really talking about equitable funding in the arts, especially not just for Indigenous people, but for people of color, people who are differently abled, for LGBT, and really trying to shed light that there needs to be greater equity. And so they created this image, and you'll see it come up shortly. It's ombre, if you will. It starts here on the left as being kind of this pale color, moving to green and to red. So just really quick, I'll read them in case you don't see them. The first stage is my organization has not identified or built relationships with local Indigenous communities. Number 2 is my organization is interested in relationships with local Indigenous communities, but is unsure where to begin. The third is my organization demonstrates its commitment to fostering connections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in its operations, programs, and audiences. And the fourth stage is my organization demonstrates its commitment to fostering connections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in its operations, staff, leadership, and board. So those are really powerful stages. So this is really just a quick and easy self-assessment tool that you can do for yourself. So just looking at it, thinking about number 1, where do I fit on that? Like identify which statement represents my personal practice in land acknowledgements. And this could be something for artists or for people at home, just wanting to think about where they are and how they've integrated land acknowledgement into their life. And then
yeah, maybe, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go for it. Go for it.
And then after we talk about that, it's extending it to my organization. So I think a lot of times we have our personal lives and our personal practices, but perhaps our employer or the school or the agency that we work with or for aren't necessarily at the same stage that we're at, for better or worse, whichever it is. So this is where you can do a self-assessment, but also assessing an agency.
Yeah, I think this is such a great tool, and it probably also indicates, and I know you used this before, and you probably got a lot of wide responses and reactions to it. It indicates there might be some people in those organizations that are actually demonstrating that commitment, but then people within the organization that are on the other part of the spectrum. So learning how to start working together with everybody so that we can all kind of get aligned on this spectrum, and moving towards well, I guess on mine is the right, but where there's a commitment to fostering those connections, I think is really important. Especially because you could feel kind of lonely if you're the only person in there that's doing that. And then also just thinking about the differences in our individual, like you said, in our individual practice. And again, for folks in the audience, if you feel comfortable, feel free to share, kind of where you think you're at or where you think your organization is at within this particular spectrum. Again, we want to create a collective dialogue here and try to get as many thoughts and ideas as we can. So feel free to share your thoughts there.
And I think this very series that Theachuchas is hosting is really exemplifying this type of introspection to where they are at these stages. Of course, amplifying and uplifting the Indigenous populations that they focus on working with, but also asking that question of who are the Indigenous peoples from these lands that we're working on, and how do we support them? And this is, the birth and the product of those conversations. So I think Theachuchas is doing a really good job in, leading by example and showing that Indigenous peoples have a responsibility to one another as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's such an important point. Just looking at some of the comments here, um, it looked like some people would have identified as indigenous, and then Scott had actually posted the native land where people can know like where they're located and what territories they're on. Um, and then a couple comments of thank you and appreciation, and then also Yao. Good to see you, Yao, Raramuri, Mazawa, and living in Tataviam and Tongva territory. Um, thank you for being here. Yeah, so utilizing the tool like this can really jumpstart conversations, help organizations jumpstart conversations. But I think maybe moving from this place, once you start to have these conversations, um, I know that you've developed some activities that could kind of be useful at learning how to position yourself within history to get a really good sense of how things from the past, policies from the past, events from the past have affected us and how they're maybe impacting who we are today.
I think it's really beautiful to think about where we are in terms of arts. And there's this woman, Roberta Uno, who is a playwright and developed this one interactive activity to talk about simultaneous histories. And what that really means is history is happening all the time, right? It's those
Right.
moments in time, but how people react to it can be very different because one policy can have a detrimental impact on another family and seem innocuous to another family across the world. And so there is this need to talk about simultaneous histories and understand how, throughout space and time, events and policies can shape and impact families. So we're going to have a graphic come up of some dates in time, and there's a lot of, and I'll just say trigger warning right now, because there are a lot of policies in there that were hurtful and may continue to be hurtful to families as
Yeah.
we think about harm over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think as you look at them, some of the dates you will see that comes up: 1850, an act for the government of protection of Indians, which legalized Indian slavery here in California. And I should mention that the use of Indians is the word in a lot of settler colonial language, but a lot of times we go by Native American. But it's always best to just ask an Indigenous person, how is the respectful way to refer to you and your people? And you'll get a lot of different answers. There's hundreds of tribes,
Yeah.
you're going to get hundreds of responses as well. And then in there's other dates that go on. And we just want to acknowledge that as Indigenous peoples, there are a lot of policies that targeted us, but at the same time there were other policies that were targeting other groups. On here you see the Japanese American internment policy and what happened to Japanese and Japanese descendants during the World War II era. And even up until today, in 2002, the Patriot Homeland Security Act, which created ICE, which impacts a lot more recent Indigenous immigrants from south of the border. And so as we think about, what is that impact on us? Do any of those impact you?
Yeah, those are great questions. And again, this kind of activity, I think, is one of the things that I really appreciated about, you mentioned simultaneous histories, that there's a nonlinear approach to viewing this, that the things that have happened in the past, especially because there hasn't really been a lot of reconciliation or reparative action, still are with us today, still causing harm, people still being, individual, behavior per se. So it doesn't mean just because this person is making this particular type of decisions that we should just be blaming them. It actually puts the focus on to the systems of dominance that are around us. And when you look at that list that you had, and that's just a very brief list actually. What you see is the violence of settler colonialism, and the enslavement of Black people, of Indigenous people, exploitation of Asian people's bodies, Latino people's bodies, Mexican people's bodies for labor. You see all that there. You see the marginalization and the violence towards queer communities, communities with disabilities. And so just like you said, there's all sorts of areas for us to focus on. I know that there were some questions that I don't know if we want to pose those questions or if or yeah, maybe let's start with that.
I think, again, this is another one of those potential self assessment tools to find out how history has impacted yourself. That first part being identifying a time in history, a policy or practice that impacted your family before you were born. And then, step two is identifying a policy and practice that's occurred in your lifetime that's impacted you. And there are a lot of different elements I think that people can pull from. And I would love to see if the audience can identify it. I know it can be difficult in order to articulate some of those, perhaps. So I would share mine in terms of an event that happened before I was born that impacted my family would be what happened to the 18 treaties of the 1850s. I think a lot of people are unaware that California was illegally annexed into the United States, and the United States illegally extinguished an Aboriginal land title for the right to occupancy. And you think, well, what does that have to do with today, a century and a half later? Because of that led up to the reason why there's so many tribes in California that lack federal acknowledgement, including my own, who are state recognized, who have been fighting to reaffirm the rights of our tribe to our legally upheld sovereignty in the United States. And it goes back to those first bad acts when our tribes negotiated in good faith and went back to Senate, and Senate refused to ratify in the secret session of US Senate and then put a secrecy injunction on it. And you think about history impacts people. So now we have to fight for our religion. We have to fight for our kids when they're taken into foster care. We have to fight for our environment and our rights to take care of it as the people of the land and enact our ancestral instructions. And so the legacy of bad history still impacts us today and still creates harm. And that's one way that I can recognize the 1850s and this policy having a bad impact on my family and Indigenous peoples in the state.
Yeah, and I mean that, and just listening to that gives me, a lot to think about and consider, but it also brings up a lot of pain, about like what your family still has to deal with and what ways we're trying to heal. I think for my family, although there's quite a few here, one of them I would talk about is like the Indian boarding schools or assimilationist policies that, with the explicit intention of to kill the Indian to save the man. And that was such a, and I bring that up for several reasons. One, my great grandmother was, forced to go to a boarding school, a Chimawa boarding school, and with the intention of killing the Indianness inside of her so she could hopefully become human. I think that was their idea, but also because, and that's my profession, was complicit in that and carried out that legacy of violence towards Indigenous people, but also to Black people, to Asian people, to people with disabilities, queer communities, really all across the board. And so that idea of killing something inside of you for this assimilation into a white Eurocentric, worldview is really, really destructive and has left a legacy, I think, of trauma within our family that is hard to still talk about and really even know where to begin to have those conversations.
Exactly. And that step two for this particular self-assessment tool is figuring out, what happened in your lifetime that has an impact on you right now and that might continue to impact you.
Right.
And that other one for me is in 2018, I tried to get a permit from the County of Los Angeles and the City of Los Angeles to gather acorns on government-owned property, and they had to call me back. In the century and a half since these governments have been founded, they never put together a process for Indigenous peoples from these lands to gather our own food. And how does that affect our food sovereignty? How does that impact my ability to teach my daughter her responsibility and how to gather and how to have Indigenous foods? I mean, these are all cyclical things that impact our culture, impact our food system, impact our bodies, impact our community health. It's just like a domino effect of one thing after another when we have bad policies or even the absence of good policies.
Right. And these are very basic things. These are, I mean, survival things, and that are so critical. And yet, again, pointing to that legacy of historical trauma, and violence, an ongoing project of settler colonialism. As we've talked about before, it's not just an event; it's an ongoing process, and actually an ongoing practice. And I think that's what you just shared. So those are really powerful questions for folks to think about, and really, kind of again highlighting the simultaneity of violence and how these histories, intersect. But I'm also thinking, kind of thinking about what are the ways that Native people and Indigenous people have pushed back. What are sort of the counter storytelling that people have pushed back? And I think we have an example of that. I know you're maybe you're going to talk about it with regards to the renaming Maclay video.
Yes, the Fernandeno Tataviam tribe has been talking about how do we undo previous harm, and what does that mean? What are those examples? And one of them is truth telling. And through that, we've created a PSA about renaming Maclay Street. He was a settler who took our last village lands, and had we kept those lands, and had he not taken them while being in cahoots with the judge in that case, then our tribe would have been federally recognized back before the turn of the last century. And so it's just the truth telling and asking people, can we rename streets? They're innocuous to you, but to us, we have to see the name of this settler every day. And by the way, our tribe's headquarters are right next to that street. So it's that everyday example and microaggressions of settler colonization. So whenever we're ready, let's just see the video.
Hamanat Nioton, Rudy Ortega Jr., Tomiyar Pasivitam Tatavitam. Hello, my name is Rudy Ortega Jr. I'm the tribal president of the Fernandeno Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. My tribe is a coalition of lineages originating in the Simi Valley, Santa Cruz Valley, San Fernando Valley, and Antelope Valley. Dear community, I come to you today to talk to you about the importance of what the tribe is pursuing and what we are asking as a tribal nation. In recent news, you may have heard that the tribe requested a resolution from the city of San Fernando to replace the street name Maclay Avenue to Tataviam Tribe Avenue.
Maclay Street Avenue needs to change.
Because Maclay evicted our peoples from our land, we were not made a federally recognized tribe.
The reason why we're seeking this is because of the injustice that occurred to our ancestors, the original people of Pachinga, now known as San Fernando, whose stories have not been forgotten. Specifically, we're talking about the land disposition that occurred to Rogelio Rocha, our tribal captain, in the 19th century, who fought from the Mexican period to the American period to preserve our ancestral lands. Captain Rocha had title to the land now known as the city of San Fernando. The land offers safe space for lineages to gather and practice traditions within the privacy and protection of that land. It was also one of the last remaining land grants held by our tribe in the American period that wasn't removed due to unpaid taxes like the others were. From the 1870s and onward, ex-Senator Maclay began evicting our people from the land through two methods, the courts and brute force. First, my great-grandfather, Antonio Maria Ortega, was evicted from San Fernando, taken to Los Angeles Superior Court and ordered to pay hundreds of dollars of fines. After purchasing the land surrounding Rocha's property, ex-Senator Maclay continued evicting our people. At over 80 years old and without writing or speaking the foreign language of America, our captain fought for the lands until his death.
After the evictions occurred, and some very adverse publicity was circulated about Maclay and Porter in the Indian Rights Association brochures. Maclay tried to defend what they had done by claiming that they had afforded Rogelio Rocha and his family and others various forms of compensation and alternative residence to ease the pain of the eviction. But it was clear from affidavits that the Indian Rights Association obtained from DeSilis, from Rocha, and even from the sheriffs that had carried out the eviction, that no such offers were made. The eviction itself was brutally harsh to Rogerio Rocha and the others who were living on the land, and whose land it had been for thousands of years.
Today, not many people know who we are or realize that we are still here. I ask that you support us and learn who we are as Native people in Los Angeles County and how we contribute to the community, serve our country, and persist even though, truthfully speaking, we were supposed to be erased. Our mere existence alone is a miracle.
No more excuses when it comes to discrimination, oppression, and further victimization of victims. We are at a time where we need to come up with solutions to acknowledge true history and move forward with that reconciliation. Why? Because that's a part of healing. You cannot heal historic trauma without actually doing the work and finding ways to help people who are victims.
Oh, wow. Well, sorry, Pamela, go ahead.
Hi, how did you feel about that video?
Oh my gosh, it's so powerful. It is such a powerful video to see and to listen to. And again, it brings me back to the original statement we made about the importance of land acknowledgements and how they have to deal with like reconciliation and reclamation. And that's exactly what I see here. And it made me feel a lot better after we were talking about this previous violence. It was very healing to watch.
And I think it's really powerful to see communities, telling their own story and asking other communities to help them tell their story and to not dismiss their story, but to contextualize it and understand it and how it continues to impact them. And I think that's great about communities working together in this era.
Yeah, really important. And I think that connects, talking about working together. I think that kind of transitions to another example, I think, of what organizations can do to work with indigenous people and to support their efforts towards sovereignty. And so one of the things we had talked about was sharing the statement that CSUN has. And I know that your tribe worked closely with CSUN in developing this particular statement, but we wanted to share it here and to kind of talk about maybe as a way towards putting the pieces together to build the blocks of a statement. So I'll take a moment to read it, and then I guess we'll move from there into like a small group discussion. So the statement goes, CSUN recognizes and acknowledges the Sesavitam, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of the Sesavunga that is now occupied by our institution. And it honors their elders, past and present, and the Sesavitam the Fernandeno, Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that the Sesavitam are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community.
And I want to take a moment just to point out in that land acknowledgement, even as a tribe and from my tribe, we have our own protocols about how to do a land acknowledgement. And for us, we have to go back and to acknowledge that particular village, which thereby acknowledges that certain lineages and families and how they're today enrolled in this tribe. And so land acknowledgements are really unique, which is why we're going to give you some steps to consider when you're creating your own land acknowledgement. So land acknowledgements can really be broken down into 3 main steps. 1 is to identify, 2 is to articulate, and 3 is deliver. So here are some potential questions you want to consider. The first is you have to identify whose lands are you on every day. And how do you do that? I think, Jose, you said someone posted it in the comments, right? The native land?
Yes. I think that was Dr. Scott Andrews from Cal State Northridge.
Right, so that's a really good resource for those of you that are unfamiliar. You can go ahead and click on there and find out. Again, you want to verify for accuracy, but that would tell you whose land that you're occupying. Are there any comments that people are identifying whose lands that they're on in the chat? think I see Yao put Tataviam and Tongva lands. Were there any others? So those are some things you can do and to consider, and a resource you can use for one of the questions. The first, identifying whose lands that you're on. The second question is to consider, how does my organization benefit from the dispossession and displacement of Indigenous peoples? This can be a deep question. What do you think, Jose?
Yeah. Definitely a deep question because I think it brings up some questions about, and I think actually maybe what people are kind of talking a little bit about in the chat here, but about being settlers and about being where and kind of knowing where you're at. And so, like, for instance, I would say as a person who is living here in California, living here in Van Nuys, living here on Tataviam lands, but also identify as an Indigenous person, I know that I am also here, and teacher, also a teacher at CSUN, somehow complicit in that dispossession. And I think that is something to have to, it's hard to say, it's hard to discuss, but it's actually something that we have to kind of reconcile with. And I think that's why, like you mentioned before, this Indigenous in Us, these sessions, the work that Tichucha is doing, clearly the work that you're doing is so important. And so for us and myself, working with you, getting to know you and doing and supporting you and your sovereignty is really important because of that relationship. But I think it's really complicated, and I think you're right, it does bring up a lot of feelings.
I'm glad you were able to mention your role at CSUN, because that leads us to that next question is, how can your institution or as individuals build equitable relationships with the Indigenous peoples' lands who you occupy?
Yeah, that's another really powerful question. I think one of those things, if we were in person right now, this would be one of those great activities where we'd have like up on paper and we'd be talking about it and having people write down ideas. And I can think of so many great, opportunities for administrators to be there, to be thinking through some of these questions, and really, and having Indigenous people there to have dialogues about that. Because what does it mean to build an equitable relationship? Because it's not going to be enough just by doing making that statement, but there has to be something more, like you said, and maybe that's the third part about the deliver.
Right, and it's talking about how do we go ahead and build these relationships, and what are different examples? And there are a lot of examples out there, and I think people can be really creative in their own personal practice on a land acknowledgement and what that means in their life. But I also want to make sure that we're also taking into consideration, I know from the tribal side of this question of how do we do this without creating too much emotional labor for Indigenous peoples. I don't think sometimes people realize how emotional things can be to talk about, intergenerational trauma and the continued impacts of today. So sometimes these questions are really loaded.
Yeah. And again, sometimes because it's also put on us, our shoulders, to be like the representative for all Indigenous people. So you have to be that one person in the room that look to you and like, so what should we do here, Jose? What should we do, Pamela? And you're right, that is just an extra load versus starting to examine, what things they can actually do. So I think at this point, did we lose the live feed?
I don't think so. I think we're still going.
Okay, we're still going. Okay, on mine it looked like it shut down for a second. So I apologize about that. But I think you had one other question you were going to talk, or a couple other questions we were going to talk about, and I think how does land acknowledgement honor Indigenous peoples? And I think that's related to the equitable question, but still a really important question to ask. Did anyone? I lost my feed for a second here. Did anyone put any comments in the chat?
I see a question here is, what is the protocol for Southern Natives who migrated north to hold ceremony in these lands? I think that's really a really good question, because one is talking about a land acknowledgement, in essence, what that means, into respect and reciprocity, and really grounding us into where we are. but also having those conversations about ceremony and how Indigenous peoples, such as my tribe, would never be a gatekeeper to any other Indigenous people's ceremonial practice. And so much about our ancestral practices for ceremony are about healing. And we know about a lot of those dark histories for Indigenous peoples, and we would never want to stand in the way for healing. I think some of those respectful ways is to identify the Indigenous peoples whose lands you're on, contact them about their spiritual people, find out to make sure you're not harvesting our sacred white sage plant and in a destructive way that then impacts our good medicine as a general practice.
Yeah. And, you know, Pamela, there was another question that came up. I'm sorry, I had lost my feed there for a second, but the question is, I was just wondering in what context of Indigenous people should answer the question on the history posed by the speakers. If they identify as Indigenous in Mexico, do they get to answer the question, or is it Indigenous in US? And I think this had to do with the simultaneous histories.
At the end of the day, I think one rule to remember is that Indigenous peoples are their own experts. So whatever tribal community they're from, they know their truths. And if they don't know their truth, we have to practice cultural humility ourselves and know that we need to go check with our elders or with our knowledgeable people to find that answer. And that I think there's a lot of truth or a lot of power in honesty. Being honest when we don't know something or understand something, and just checking in our own tribal community and giving that same respect to other Indigenous communities as well.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for the questions. If you have any other questions, feel free to put them into the comment section. I know we have about 10 minutes or so left, and I know we have a video we still like to share. So maybe start to shifting towards our closing statements.
I think there are a lot of things that we consider as a takeaway, and just to give you food for thought. You don't have to have the answers to all these questions right now. It's to get you going and to understand how to build a land acknowledgement, but also that it takes time and effort to do one. So 1, locate yourself on Indigenous lands, know who lands you're on. 2, develop language that is respectful. 3, reflect on what might be missing. Is something might seem good to you, but you might want to check with those Indigenous peoples and make sure that it's consistent with their practices. And that brings me to 4, which is pick up the phone, write an email, but first go to the website of that tribal nation and find out more about them. You got to do the work too as a visitor to these lands. And number 5, simplest thing you can do as your very first step to supporting the Indigenous peoples whose lands you occupy is follow them on social media. Find out what they're doing on Facebook, find out about their call to actions and what would help their people. It could be as simple as liking them, sharing a tweet, whatever is necessary. Buying some native art from their artists would always appreciate that. What about any other ideas you have, Jose?
Well, I mean, first of all, those are awesome ideas, and especially social media, because that is the primary way that a lot of people communicate today. So I think absolutely, to do those kind of things as well. I would say though too, if you are a person who have never thought about, Indigenous people before, you hold on to some really terrible narratives that all Indigenous people are disappeared, or all you know is from cowboy and western films, or whatever other very one-dimensional, flat, stereotypical characters you know about. I would really encourage people to start challenging those narratives and to start doing some more reading, watching more documentaries made by Native people, by Indigenous people, and start to learn and start to challenge those narratives, and so that you can start to see and unlearn how you have been complicit in these settler colonial projects, and how that may shift your perspective. And I think as you start to do that, that may actually start to help with going back to what you said before about some of that emotional labor that we put on to Indigenous people or people of color just in general. To do that homework on your own. And a great place to learn that information is to go to Tia Chucha's, who has a great bookstore, to go to the Fernandeno Tataviam website, and when we cannot have to be social distance all the time, but to support their efforts, show up at their events, and support them in that way. And being on social media is a really good way to raise awareness to do that. So I would add some of those as well. I'll go. Sorry, Pamela, go ahead.
I think that's great, and really respecting that, and also knowing that our tribe supports Indigenous peoples who are displaced here as well, and recognizing that history is always happening. And we have our nonprofit, Pukuu Cultural Community Services, which does do a lot of social services, and we do provide services to other Indigenous peoples as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed in the comments, someone put here, Patricia. Oh, Patricia, good to see you. I'm also seeing a lot of Native youth who are becoming successful on TikTok. All right, so that's where I need to go. That's the next adventure for me, is to learn TikTok. But that's great. And I think that when now that you've let me know about that, that's where I will start to go and to learn. But definitely, like you said, Pamela, it's to support Native. There's so many vibrancy in Native communities and in the arts and music and scholarship that we can support. I know we're kind of coming up to a close. Are there any final thoughts or ideas you want to share before we wrap up? And I think we're going to wrap up with a video from the Pukuu Cultural Center. So, but yeah, was there any final words you wanted to say?
This week, Thanksgiving is close upon us. I want to make sure that I give gratitude to Tiochuchas, to you, Jose, to my tribe, to all of our allies who are supporting the Fernandeno Tataviam people. But I also want to uplift the Wampanoag, who are the people who are often not mentioned in Thanksgiving story, in that mythical tale, but who are very much alive today and continue to fight for the sovereignty of their people as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pamela. It's always an honor to get to talk to you, to share knowledge and share your insight. I always learned a lot from you. Even the conversation we had leading up to this was really, really beneficial. So always honored to get a chance to talk to you. And thank you so much for being here today. And also express my gratitude to the entire Fernandeno Tataviam tribe, as well as Tiochuchas, for this invitation to be part of this. I feel really lucky and fortunate to be here. And just to read a few other things, we have one more workshop left in the series that's set for next Monday, November 30th, with the women from Silmar Hummingbird Lodge sharing their experiences on ceremonial healing. So follow Tiochuchas on Facebook or Instagram on details to sign up. And for more information about the Fernandeno Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, visit their website, www.tataviam-nsn.us, or follow them on Facebook or Instagram. And so I think from here, we're going to, kind of close out with a video that we're going to be watching in just a little bit. So once again, thank you for everyone for tuning in today. Really honored to be here and do this, and enjoy the video.
Los Angeles County is home to over 70,000 Native American and Alaska Native people, one of the largest urban American Indian populations in the United States. Pukuu Cultural and Community Services nonprofit organization leads the way in helping Native American families from the San Fernando Valley and beyond. Established by the Fernandeno Tataviam Band of Mission Indians in 1971, Pukuu provides services for low-income American Indian families by offering emergency financial assistance, education support, family and child development, cultural enhancement, and more. Pukuu's one-stop emergency services program offers temporary aid to low-income Native Americans who've encountered a financial emergency. The program is designed to help elders 55 and older, the disabled, and pregnant women to receive food and services when most needed. Pukuu's American Indian Cultural Center, Haramukna, is located in the Angeles National Forest. It sits in the middle of the Gabriano National Recreation Trail and is a traditional resting spot for pre-contact tribes on the historic trade route to or from the desert and the sea. The Cultural Center provides an exhibit space for the 5 tribes of the San Gabriel Mountains: Tongva, Tataviam, Chumash, Kitanamuk, and Serrano. The center offers an opportunity to reconnect spiritually, culturally, environmentally, and socially. Pukuu's Tuchient program offers direct educational services for grades 7 to 12, including group workshops for tutoring, urban theater, leadership, and a youth-led summer conference. The Fatherhood Journey program helps fathers learn how to be role models and how to be more engaged in the lives of their children. The Stronger Family Fund encourages American Indian families to foster American Indian youth and provides financial support and referrals while waiting for assistance from the Department of Children and Family Services. Pukuu's annual fundraiser, A Night with the Stars, successfully raises money for scholarships for Native Americans in higher education. During the time of COVID-19, Pukuu pivoted to create ongoing digital content for the community. Through the Cultural Advocacy, Resiliency, and Empowerment Program, the Pukuu Party Hour events established a virtual hub with local businesses and nonprofits to create online bingo games, education about the 2020 census, fashion shows, meditation workshops, and even a virtual powwow. The CARE program helps to implement a variety of opportunities related to cultural empowerment, health and community wellness, and celebrates the diversity of the Los Angeles Native community. Pukuu's ability to adapt is just one of the many reasons why they are a leading nonprofit organization supporting Native Americans in the San Fernando Valley and beyond. Please find us on Facebook, Instagram, or visit Pukuu on the internet at pukuu.org. We thank you for taking the time to learn more about Pukuu and all that we do.